The morning began like any typical Saturday in Riverside Meadows, with me watering my petunias and savoring the tranquility had worked so hard to achieve. That serenity was abruptly destroyed when two patrol cars pulled into my driveway, sirens silent, but lights flashing. I knew precisely who had summoned them before the officers even emerged. Sure enough, there stood Patricia Harrington, our HOA president, pointing at me with the rage of someone who had just spotted a dandelion in her flawless lawn. "That stranger has been loitering in our community for 35 minutes, she screamed, her voice echoing across the impeccably manicured lawns. "I demand that you remove him immediately." Officer Thompson, whom I had worked with for 15 years, stepped out of his cruiser and glanced between Patricia and me. His partner, Officer Chen, followed, struggling to suppress a smirk. Thompson cleared his throat and spoke in his most professional tone. "Ma'am, that's Chief Daniel Morrison. He runs the 911 dispatch center for the entire county." Patricia's finger stayed pointed at me, trembling slightly. "Now, I don't care if he's the Pope himself. He's not on my approved resident list, and he's trespassing on private property. Let me back up and explain how I ended up in this absurd situation. My name is Daniel Mauricio and I'm 47 years old. After 2 decades as a first responder and the last 8 years directing the county's emergency services dispatch center, I decided I needed to escape the chaos of downtown. All I wanted was a quiet neighborhood where I could grow tomatoes, read on my porch, and avoid hearing sirens every 5 minutes. Riverside Meadows seemed ideal. Nice houses, tree-lined streets, and far enough from the city that I could actually see stars at night. What the real estate agent neglected to mention was that the neighborhood came with Patricia Harrington, an HOA president who managed our small community like it was a military compound under constant threat. Patricia was the type of person who ironed her khakis with military precision and color-coordinated her clipboards. She once issued a citation to the Thompson family's 10-year-old daughter for what she called reckless scootering because the child had dared to ride on the sidewalk after 4:00 p.m. The bylaws, Patricia insisted, clearly stated that wheeled recreational devices were only permitted during designated hours. I had purchased a modest 2-story colonial with a decent-sized yard at the end of Maple Court. I moved in quietly on a Tuesday afternoon. No moving trucks blocking traffic. No housewarming party disturbing the peace. Just me, a few boxes, and my plans for a vegetable garden. Apparently, that low-key approach was my first mistake. Within days, Patricia appeared at my door with a clipboard and a frown that seemed permanently etched into her face. "You failed to register with the HOA Welcome Committee," she announced, as if I had committed a federal crime. "I'll need to see 2 forms of government-issued ID and proof of home ownership." I showed her my driver's license and mentioned that the deed was still being processed. She made a note on her clipboard with such force, I thought she might rip through the paper. "Unverified resident," she muttered loudly enough for me to hear. That was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Patricia found violation after violation of my property. First, it was a warning about the excessive neutrality of my fence color. Apparently, my choice of natural wood stain didn't meet the HOA's standards for neighborhood cohesion. Then came a notice about my failure to display appropriate window decorations during what she called patriotic celebration periods. The citation that really irritated me was for unauthorized herb cultivation. I had planted some basil and oregano in small pots on my back deck. According to Patricia, all plant additions required prior approval from the HOA's Landscape Committee, which coincidentally consisted of Patricia and her 2 cronies, who agreed with everything she said. I tried to be reasonable. I attended an HOA meeting to discuss the citations. Speaking calmly and professionally, I pointed out that nothing in the actual bylaws prohibited herb gardens or mandated specific fence colors. Patricia's response was to label me as uncooperative and potentially hostile in the next HOA newsletter, which she personally delivered to every mailbox in the neighborhood. After that meet, I noticed Patricia watching my house from her window. She lived directly across the street, which gave her a perfect view of my driveway and front yard. Every time I came home from work, there she was, peering through her blinds like some sort of suburban spy. My work vehicle didn't help matters. As dispatch chief, I drove an unmarked county car equipped with hidden emergency lights and communication equipment. To Patricia, this was clearly suspicious. One evening, as I pulled into my driveway after a particularly long shift dealing with a multi-car accident on the highway, I saw her snapping photos of my car with her phone. The next morning, every HOA board member received an email with the subject line, "Suspicious male with government vehicle observed multiple times." The email, which was later forwarded to me by my neighbor Tom, included blurry photos of me getting out of my car and what Patricia described as clandestine behavior patterns consistent with surveillance activities. Tom had laughed when he showed me the email. "She thinks you're with the FBI or something," he said, shaking his head. Last year, she was convinced the new family from California was sent by the state government to investigate her tax returns. I figured Patricia would eventually tire of her surveillance and find a new target. I was wrong. If anything, her scrutiny intensified. She started documenting what time I left for work, when I returned, and how long I spent in my yard. She even filed a complaint about my irregular schedule, suggesting it was disturbing the neighborhood's predictable routine. The situation reached absurd levels when she issued a citation for excessive garden hose deployment. Apparently, I had left my hose uncoiled for more than the HOA maximum of 30 minutes after watering. The fine was $75, which I refused to pay on principle. Patricia responded by sending a formal letter threatening legal action if I didn't comply with HOA regulations. The letter, written in language that sounded like she had copied it from a legal thriller novel, accused me of willful violation of community standards and creating an atmosphere of discord. I dealt with difficult people throughout my career. Panicked callers, angry citizens upset about response times, and even the occasional conspiracy theorists who believed the 911 system was monitoring their thoughts. But Patricia Harrington was in a category all her own. Everything came to a head on what should have been a peaceful Sunday morning. I decided to install a rain barrel to collect water for my garden, both to save money and because I believed in water conservation. It was a simple project that would take maybe an hour. I was in my driveway, dressed in old jeans and work gloves, drilling the spigot attachment, when Patricia emerged from her house. She stood at the edge of her lawn, arms crossed, watching me like a hawk. I gave her a polite nod and continued working. 20 minutes later, I heard the sirens. At first, I assumed they were heading somewhere else, but they grew louder and closer until 2 patrol cars turned onto Maple Court. I stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans, wondering what emergency could be happening in our quiet neighborhood. The cars stopped in front of my house. Officers Thompson and Chen stepped out, looking confused. Thompson approached me slowly, his hand nowhere near his weapon, which told me he didn't consider this a real emergency. "Chief Morrison," he said, clearly puzzled. "We got a call about a suspicious person tampering with residential infrastructure." Before I could respond, Patricia came charging across the street, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "It's about time you arrived," she shouted. "This man has been using power tools without a permit. He could be installing surveillance equipment, or worse." Chen looked at the rain barrel, then at Patricia, then at me. "Ma'am, that's a rain barrel. You can buy them at any hardware store." "I don't care what he claims it is," Patricia insisted, her voice rising to a pitch that made dogs bark 3 houses away. "He's been lurking around this property for weeks, coming and going at all hours." Refusing to properly identify himself to the HOA authority, Thompson rubbed his temple, a gesture I recognized from years of working together. It was his "I can't believe this is happening" move. "Ma'am," as I said, "this is Chief Morrison. He runs the county's 911 dispatch center. He's our boss." Patricia's face went through several shades of red before settling on something close to purple. "That's impossible," she sputtered. "I would have been informed if someone in that position moved into our neighborhood. We have protocols." "Well, I can assure you he's who we say he is," Chen added, trying not to smile. "We've worked under Chief Morrison for years. He's one of the most respected people in county emergency services." Patricia stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to process this information while maintaining her authority. Finally, she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. "Be that as it may," she said, with as much dignity as she could muster, "he still failed to register with the HOA and has multiple outstanding violations. His position doesn't exempt him from community standards." Thompson looked at me with an expression that clearly said, "What do you want us to do about this crazy lady?" I shook my head slightly. The last thing I wanted was to make this an official matter. "Officers, I apologize for wasting your time," I said calmly. "As you can see, I'm just installing a rain barrel. I'll be sure to work with Mrs. Harrington to resolve any HOA concerns through proper channels." Patricia huffed and marched back to her house, but not before announcing loudly that this matter was far from over and that she would be calling an emergency HOA meeting to discuss security protocols for verifying suspicious residents. After the officers left, both apologizing for the inconvenience and promising to have a word with dispatch about screening these types of calls better, I went back to my rain barrel. But I could feel Patricia watching from her window, probably documenting how many screws I used and whether they were HOA approved. News of the incident spread through Riverside Meadows faster than a California wildfire. By that evening, Tom had texted me saying half the neighborhood was talking about how Patricia had called the cops on the police chief. My next-door neighbor, Janet, dropped by with cookies and an apology for our overzealous HOA president. "She means well," Janet said, though her expression suggested otherwise. "She just gets a bit carried away sometimes." Last year, she tried to have the Millers evicted because their daughter's Girl Scout cookie stand violated commercial zoning laws. The HOA board, which had previously rubber-stamped all of Patricia's decisions out of fear or apathy, suddenly found themselves in an uncomfortable position. The vice president, Robert Dalton, called me personally to apologize and to ask, in a roundabout way, if there was any chance his son could get a tour of the dispatch center for his criminal justice class. I told Robert that I held no grudges, but I also made it clear that using emergency services for non-emergencies was a serious matter. He assured me the board would address it at the next meeting. Meanwhile, Patricia doubled down on her campaign against me. She sent out a neighborhood-wide email blast titled, "Know Your Rights. HOA Authority Supersedes Job Titles." In it, she argued that my position in county government was irrelevant to HOA governance and that allowing exceptions would lead to chaos and property value decline. The email backfired spectacularly. Someone and I never found out who created an anonymous flyer that started appearing on doorsteps. It featured a crude drawing of Patricia with binoculars and devil horns under the title, "Who Watches the Watcher?" The flyer listed every ridiculous citation she had issued over the past year, from the scootering incident to the time she fined the Johnsons for having their Christmas lights up until January 2 end. Patricia responded by increasing her surveillance of the neighborhood, particularly my house. She started carrying a camera with a telephoto lens during her morning walks, snapping pictures of any perceived violations. She even set up what looked like a security camera pointed directly at my driveway. Though she claimed it was a bird-watching device, the monthly HOA meeting was usually a quiet affair attended by maybe a dozen residents who had nothing better to do on a Thursday evening. But word had gotten out about the police incident, and the community center was packed. People who hadn't attended an HOA meeting in years showed up, including several who didn't even live in Riverside Meadows, but wanted to see the drama unfold. I arrived early and took a seat in the front row. Patricia was already at the podium, arranging her papers and adjusting the microphone. When she saw me, her lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. The meeting started with the usual business of approving minutes and discussing the pool maintenance schedule. But everyone was waiting for the main event, and Patricia knew it. When she finally reached new business on the agenda, she launched into a speech about maintaining standards and the importance of proper procedures. "Some recent events have highlighted the need for stricter enforcement of our bylaws," she said pointedly, not looking at me. "We cannot allow anyone, regardless of their outside position or influence, to flout the rules that keep our community safe and orderly." That's when I raised my hand. Patricia ignored me for a full 30 seconds before Robert, the vice president, cleared his throat and said, "Chief Morrison has the floor." I stood up slowly, using the same calm voice I used when directing emergency responses. "Thank you, Robert. I'd like to address the board and my neighbors about the recent misuse of emergency services." Patricia's face went red. "That's not on the agenda," she interrupted. "Actually," Robert said, glancing at his papers, "resident concerns are always permitted during new business." I continued, keeping my tone professional. "As many of you know, 911 services are for emergencies only. When someone calls to report a homeowner installing a rain barrel as suspicious activity, it takes resources away from real emergencies. During the 20 minutes officers were at my house last Sunday, there was a domestic violence call and a cardiac event that had to be handled by units from neighboring districts. The room was silent. I could see people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. I pulled out my phone and referenced the actual county statutes. According to County Code 17.35, making a false or frivolous 911 call is a misdemeanor punishable by fines up to $1,000 and up to 6 months in jail. Repeated violations can be charged as a felony. Patricia gripped the podium. "I was reporting genuine suspicious activity. You can't threaten me for doing my civic duty." "I'm not threatening anyone," I replied calmly. "I'm informing the community about the law." Additionally, HOA boards that encourage or enable harassment of residents can be held liable under state housing laws. The damages in such cases can be substantial. An older gentleman in the back raised his hand. "So, what you're saying is we could all be sued because of her?" He pointed at Patricia. "I'm saying that HOA boards have a responsibility to act reasonably and within the law," I answered. "Encouraging residents to call 911 for non-emergencies or creating a culture of harassment opens the association to significant legal liability." The room erupted in concerned murmurs. Board members started whispering among themselves. Patricia tried to regain control, banging her gavel and calling for order, but the damage was done. Robert stood up and addressed the room. "In light of this information, I moved to suspend the HOA president for 90 days pending a review of recent enforcement actions." "You can't do that," Patricia shrieked. "I've been protecting this neighborhood for 7 years. All in favor?" Robert asked, ignoring her protests. Every hand on the board went up except Patricia's. Even her usual allies voted against her, probably calculating their own legal exposure. Patricia stood there for a moment, her face cycling through expressions of shock, anger, and disbelief. Then she drew herself up to her full height of 5'3", saluted the room for some inexplicable reason, and marched out, her clipboard clutched to her chest. The meeting continued for another hour, with the board voting to reverse several of Patricia's recent citations and establishing new guidelines for what constituted a valid HOA complaint. They also voted to require board approval before any member could contact law enforcement about HOA matters. As people filed out, several stopped to apologize to me for the whole situation. I told them all the same thing, that I harbored no ill will and just wanted to enjoy my home in peace. 3 months later, Patricia's suspension ended, but she didn't return to the HOA board. She now jogs through the neighborhood every morning with a GoPro camera strapped to her head, recording what she calls evidence for future action. Residents have learned to cross the street when they see her coming. As for me, the board somehow convinced me to accept the position of HOA vice president. I didn't want the job, but they argued that nobody else trusted anyone else with any power. After the Patricia debacle, I used the position mainly to repeal unnecessary bylaws and host monthly silent barbecues where people can actually enjoy their neighborhood without fear of citations. The rain barrel still sits in my backyard, collecting water for my expanding garden. I've added tomatoes, peppers, and even some unauthorized squash. Nobody has complained. Last week, Patricia tried one more time to cause trouble by filing a formal complaint with the county about my abuse of power. The county attorney responded by fining her $500 for misuse of the legal system and warned that any further frivolous complaints would result in criminal charges. When the sheriff's deputy delivered the fine notice, Patricia's shriek of indignation could be heard 3 blocks away.